It's that time of year where everyone talks about relegation in the Six Nations. And with recent strong performances from Tier 2, let's take a look at 3 points from actions that they can take right now to long-term changes that will build a roadmap that leads us to relegation in the Six Nations. Without, the financial destruction of Rugby Union in Europe. And we're working under the assumption that the Six Nations wants pro-rel for the purposes of this video, which I'm pretty sure they don't. Anyway, the first step should be getting eyes on the Rugby Europe Championship, which is the next highest level competition in Europe after the Six Nations. And you'd be shocked by how many people don't know it exists. I mean, 25% of you didn't know what it was in my community poll, which I think is quite significant because I would presume that people actively engaging in rugby content on YouTube are a bit more hardcore than your average Six Nations viewer. I've read countless Reddit posts and comments on this channel about how there should be a competition which teams like Georgia, Portugal and Spain compete in. Well, it already exists and has in many different formats since the 1930s, but the current edition has been going since 2016. But part of the problem is people don't know about it because nobody talks about it in the circles that Six Nations fans operate. So my plan for this comes in 2 stages, but I doubt the second would ever happen, and I mean the whole thing probably would never happen. But anyway, the first step is to get the Six Nations to start acknowledging its existence. It's very simple. Have the Six Nations accounts on social media post the results, tables and information about the teams. You can then build on this with having TV channels like ITV, RTE and BBC etc. show scores at the end of the Six Nations games alongside the Six Nations results. Just little things like that make people aware that this competition even exists. The next step would be TV distribution. The Rugby Europe Championship doesn't even have a UK TV deal. You have to watch it on the Rugby Europe website. If the Six Nations and Rugby Europe Championship came together to make the next broadcasters of the Six Nations show at least some of the games of the Rugby Europe Championship, that could go a long way. Imagine if on Saturday there was a midday kickoff in the Rugby Europe Championship before the Six Nations game, and another either before or after the Sunday game too. If you wanted to go even further, you could arrange the games in a way where the 2 Six Nations ties are sandwiching the Rugby Europe Championship tie. It'd be pretty cool to have Scotland versus England and Ireland versus Wales with Georgia versus Portugal, Belgium, in between. If the Six Nations does go to a paid platform like Amazon Prime, which I don't want by the way, they could show every game from the 2 competitions quite easily with it being a streaming service. And we aren't even talking about revenue splits at this point. In this scenario, the Six Nations isn't sharing any revenue with the Rugby Europe Championship. This would entirely be about getting eyes on the Rugby Europe Championship. The next step is much more actionable right now. Instead of having an under-20s Six Nations, let's replace it with an under-20s European Championship, where the under-20s teams from 16 of the 47 Rugby Europe countries play. It could have 4 groups of 4, then a semi-final and a final, and the teams getting to the end wouldn't play more than the 5 games they currently do in the under-20 Six Nations. You could even have a Vase, Plate and Bowl, all with 3rd place playoffs, so that teams who don't finish in the top of their pools still have games to play. And then relegate the guys who finished bottom to a lower tier, like what they do in the Under-20s World Championships. The Under-20 Six Nations is about development, so let's increase that across Europe and help create the next superstars from across the continent. I feel like this is something that actually could happen, and probably should, sooner rather than later. The last point is revenue sharing. This could be done in multiple ways, like parachute payments for example, but I think the better way to go would be by doing what they do in France, where they have a joint TV deal between the top 14 and the Pro D2, and they actually go beyond just a revenue share, with the top 14 and Pro D2 both being operated by the Ligue Nationale de Rugby, and all getting around the table together to discuss matters that impact professional French rugby. I've heard it said that the TV split between the 2 divisions is about 70-30, but I'm not 100% sure on that as I couldn't find much researching. But I'm going to go with that idea for the Six Nations and the Rugby Europe Championship. This is what the Six Nations' ultimate goals should be in the eyes of pro-rel. They should merge fully with the Rugby Europe Championship, and all 14 unions should have a seat at the table. This has great advantages over a parachute payment scheme. The first is that it distributes across the division, whereas a parachute payment would only be going to the team relegated. This means it leads to much better growth and sustainability across the league as opposed to just keeping the big teams big. And a merger would mean that the Six Nations can't just decide to withdraw funding in the future if they feel the tier 2 sides are getting a little bit too good. The perfect time to implement something like this could be coming up in the near future, but I would imagine that this stage would be 10 plus years down the road. These plans are sort of long term, but we are coming up to the renewal of the Six Nations TV contracts, and with murmurings of it going behind a paywall, this could be used to sweeten up the deal a bit while still making more money than they currently are. Or they can just take all the money for themselves and not care what the public thinks, which is probably what will happen, but a man can dream. But a big question is, why should the Six Nations have relegation, and does it even need it? This year it's been a very competitive championship at the bottom, and the traditional team people mention when it comes to relegation might not finish at the bottom this year. But for me, Italy has never really been a reason for relegation. I always thought it would just make the championship more interesting. But you can find out more about why we should and shouldn't have relegation by watching this video right here. Thanks for watching.